Some people think little girls should be seen and not heard, but I think, oh, bondage, up yours!
My mother was a punk rock icon. People often ask me if she was a good mum. It's hard to know what to say.
1, 2, 3, 4!
Do you think you're a rebel in today's society?
Yeah, I suppose I am a bit.
Polly had her own ideas about everything. She didn't follow trends.
She was a woman of colour in an industry full of white middle-class men.
Nobody else was singing what Polly was singing about.
I fell in love with her. I fell in love with the music.
I actually started singing because of her.
I must have been about 4 years old when I realised something wasn't right. The constant cycle of elation and despair.
I remember her coming off stage and crying her eyes out.
It seemed like she'd been through some trauma, and music was a way of dealing with that.
Everything else reflects everything else. So the music reflects what's happening around you.
People started saying she'd gone mad, but she felt she was going through a spiritual awakening.
I'm like an actress. On stage, I'm one thing, and off stage, I'm something else. I just consider myself as a person first.
I went through a period where I rejected everything that my mum cared about. But now I find solace in retracing her footsteps.
The world is playing catch-up with Poly Styrene, not the other way around.
Cliché.
Hello and welcome to this BFI at Home event. My name is Kieran Yates and today I'm joined by the filmmakers behind Poly Styrene, I Am a Cliché. The film explores Poly Styrene's life and times, and to chat about it I'm joined by co-directors Paul Sung and Celeste Bell and producer Rebecca Mark-Lawson. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really love the film and it feels like an absolute pleasure to be talking to you guys about Poly Styrene's life for people who have this sort of, by now, a very intimate knowledge of her life and times. Celeste possibly more, but definitely for Paul and Rebecca. How do you feel? How do you feel your relationship is with Poly at this point?
I mean, I love the music just as much. I mean, I made a music film before and you need, I think, a break sometimes afterwards, but with Poly's music, there's something about it that it retains a freshness. And I was actually listening to Germ-Free Adolescence yesterday on a walk, and it's still, there's so much in those songs. I mean, they're deceptively simple songs, I think. And I learned a lot about Poly. I think that's always a good starting point for any film as a director, if you know something about a story, but you want to know more. And meeting Celeste and Zoe and then Rebecca getting involved along the way, I think, we all learned so much about, what a complex woman she was. As we were saying, she had her flaws, and I think the only person that could really tell that story to its full potential was Celeste. It was an absolute pleasure to work with Celeste and our team on this film.
Tell me a little bit about how you sort of first came to the project before you got talking to Celeste. So were you and Rebecca sort of big fans beforehand, or what happened? How did that happen?
Yeah, there was well, when was it? I think it was about 2016, and I'd done a couple of Q&As with a writer called Zoe Howe, who's a wonderful music writer, and I'd said to Zoe, have you got any ideas for music docs? And she had 3 really good ideas, strongest of which was Poly. And she introduced Celeste and I, and we went for coffee. I think it was December 2016. And we talked about the type of film we'd like to make. And then Rebecca got involved. Working with Rebecca, I really learned a lot about story and narrative. And of course, having Celeste and the journey she goes on. I mean, very early on, Celeste was always in the film, but she became much more of like an equal character. Being on screen. And it is Celeste and Poly's story, and I think that makes the story more than more rich, because the mother and daughter narrative is something that I think most people can relate to beyond Poly as an artist.
What about for you, Rebecca? Because I thought one of the things that was so interesting as a viewer was that it felt like we were allowed in these 2 different lenses. So we had this sort of lens from a fan perspective, but we also had this very intimate sort of Celeste lens into, which we're not usually afforded. So how did you manage those two things?
I mean, it's a question of weaving the story in and making sure, because you've got a 3-act structure, you have to adhere to the 3 acts and the highs and lows that audiences expect at each moment. But you also have to give the fans what they want, but you also have to make it a completely universal story so that it crosses over. And I think the mother and daughter relationship, for me, that's what I was drawn to it. That's my kind of thing. I'm not necessarily a music docs person. I'm more of a kind of family relationship person. That's what I really love in films. I love that kind of emotional connection, and that was really it takes time to do that. I mean, Celeste and Zoe and Paul all kind of working together, and we tried a lot of stuff out as well. You have to try things out. Does this work? Does that work? Until suddenly a kind of a storytelling method appears, after a lot of hard work and research. And I mean, that can only happen because Paul and Celeste know the story really well. So I think for me, that's what I was interested in, is bringing in that additional layer of narrative and storytelling and character connection.
And Celeste, what about you? I mean, I wonder if it's kind of doubly strange but doubly rewarding to be a fan and a daughter telling the story in this way.
Initially, I wanted to tell the story in a book format, so that was the first project, and that's how I met Zoe. Well, I knew Zoe already, but we started working on this book together, and then shortly after we met Paul. And I understood when I went through my mum's archive, there was so much, it was so visually rich, so just a wealth of material, artwork, lyrics, and poems and photographs and sort of memorabilia. There was just so much there. And I had these diary entries. So my mother wrote a collection of diary entries in the early 2000s called Diary of the 70s. And she was looking back at each of the songs on the album Germ-Free Adolescence. And she wrote a short diary entry to go with each song. And she wasn't able to get that published. And, because she was ill and she passed away. So I decided that it would be great to bring to life these diary entries with the visual material and put them together and do a book. And I didn't think about film initially for that project, but then after speaking to Zoe and working out how we were going to do it, it just made a lot of sense, because a book can only go so far, and to really bring it to life and to really do the story justice, I think film definitely is the best format.
Yeah, I love that quote where you talk about being the caretaker of Poly Styrene's legacy. I mean, presumably you've shared the archive, so do you all have a sort of favourite piece or a favourite thing that you've come across?
I think for me it would be the artwork and the poems that are in the film, because I had no idea before meeting Celeste that Poly was effectively, she wasn't just an artist and a songwriter. She put the band together. Just seeing work that has never been seen before and kind of touching something that, the artist who's made it created, and that tactile feeling was a real honour, definitely.
I really loved seeing all of the photos, but the stuff that really touched me was the Super 8 footage that hadn't seen the light of day. You could see that they were at this stage in their careers and the band where they were really excited and, the world was their oyster. I thought that was really cool.
And Celeste, how does it feel to share that? Did you share everything, or are there a couple of guarded things that are just for you?
Obviously there's a lot there, so I don't think everyone has seen every piece of, every single copy of every lyric, because my mother wrote, there are hundreds of lyrics. So there are lots of just sort of kind of drafts, so she maybe did, 10 or 20 drafts of one song. That kind of thing is, it takes a long time to go through, but it's one of the most enjoyable things for me about the archive, like going through it, is seeing all the drafts, because then, you're seeing the process that my mum went through when it came to writing, also designing and the artwork. There are lots of drafts, lots of sort of, you know, scribbling things out and starting again. And I think that's, you know, really apt for the film as well.
Yeah, that's definitely what it feels like. And I think it's also, it's quite a unique way into looking at our recent history, especially a kind of on the backdrop of 70s Britain. I know that you sort of explored it, certainly against the race conversations that were happening, you know, of the National Front and, you know, Rock Against Racism, and this real period of political sort of resistance and turmoil. So how much of that were you sort of interested in exploring, and did you want to reflect that as the backdrop of the scene?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always interested in the political, you know, nature of any artist. I think it was good in some ways because I think when you're in a team of people, you know, your natural inclination might be to go one way, and then you've got other people that will bring you back a bit. And certainly, I think it's what Celeste and I quite early on was very clear in saying that this isn't a political film. And of course, she's right. I mean, it's a film about an artist, but we all know everything is political. And I think it has just the right amount of social commentary and politics. And the stuff about race really interested me, being mixed race myself. And, you know, there's that bit in the film early on where Poly talks about identity, and we see the march, and we see, you know, those people marching with their fists raised high. And I mean, that moment really always gets me, just seeing that, because they look so determined. And given, you know, the UK and the state of the country at the moment, and I suppose the rise of fascism that's kind of been going on, not just here, but in America, in parts of Europe, I think more than ever, you know, the values that Poly embodied and what was going on in that period, I do think we've kind of gone back a bit. I don't know, I just felt that from growing up in the 80s and experiencing racism, things were getting better. And I now think, you know, that they're getting a bit worse. And it's not necessarily because racism ever went away, but I think some people feel emboldened by things like the Brexit vote, by things like Donald Trump and other, you know, factors. So I think, you know, in terms of looking back on the past, I think, you know, we have moved on as a society, but I don't think we're out of the woods yet when it comes to issues like race, and when it comes to, you know, some of the worst elements of Thatcherism about, you know, the market and about consumerism, etc. But you know, I think it's a film that has a political content, but you know, the fundamental thing under it is an artist and a mother and daughter relationship. And I think that was always really important to keep that sort of front and center.
Well, I think it's a good point, isn't it? Because I think that sort of the far right skinheads and fascists have periodically tried to co-opt punk as a scene. And I think that this sort of really placing Poly Styrene and this legacy of Black art has been increasingly important, because of course we know that there is a really rich history of this, not only in the UK, but in the US and beyond. So how much of that was this kind of, you know, rejecting this idea that punk is the sole property of whiteness?
I think it's really important to do that. And also punk, as you mentioned, it has, you know, a history of being, in some ways, some punks certainly were kind of flirting with fascism right at the start. You know, with the imagery, the use of swastikas, you know, punks wearing swastikas, you know, on t-shirts, swastika flags would be all over the place, because it was the most shocking thing, you know, that you could display at the time. And my mum, she really stood out from punk in that sense. You know, she stood out from the other punks. She was an outsider within punk, because not only because she was a woman of color, but also because she was not interested in shocking, actually. That, you know, she was much more interested in enlightening and making people think. You know, there wasn't anything that was, you know, maybe on the surface you could say Poly Styrene in terms of the name and everything. There was something kind of, you know, playful, but it was playful, but it was very serious, and there were very serious sort of critiques of society that my mother was doing when she was writing those songs, without being overtly political at the same time, which is also a really hard balance, you know. So she wasn't preaching, she wasn't telling people what to do, how to live, or how to behave, but she was shining a light on some of the quirks of society and some of the problems of society, but asking people to think for themselves. And I don't think anyone else in punk was doing that.
I guess one of the things that I like about the film is that it's sort of like deeply beautiful and captivating, but also so frustrating. Like I found myself at so many moments so completely frustrated. And even on that point alone, I mean, I don't know, obviously I wasn't there at the time to sort of be privy to those conversations, but it's sort of undoubtable when you're watching it back now that of course Poly Styrene had this massive impact on the Riot Girl movement and Bikini Kill and, you know, all of these things that would sort of later come. You can see this direct lineage, can't you? But there felt like this was this real sort of resistance or this confrontational resistance for some of the punk scene that was happening in the UK at the time. She was really ahead of her time at even thinking about intersectional feminism, and she was sort of bound by this idea that actually your feminism, the feminism you're asking me about isn't the feminism that I'm inhabiting, and there's this sort of disconnect and you don't understand. And you know, I don't think that we've come that far, actually. I think that still exists and that frustration is still really at the surface.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, I think at the time, you know, Polly was taken seriously by, you know, some of her contemporaries. I think, you know, people at record labels, people that are gatekeepers, you know, maybe not so much. But I think in terms of how relevant she is, I mean, in the film, you know, Pauline Black says, you know, the world is playing catch up with Poly Styrene, not the other way around. And it's still true. I mean, you know, there's this idea in Greek mythology, you know, there's the figure of Cassandra who could see the future but was never believed. And the things Polly, you know, wrote about and spoke about, whether it was climate change, whether it was, you know, the negative effects of consumerist society. I mean, it wasn't as if she was, you know, shouting in the wind. You could see the evidence of these things, but, you know, she wasn't taken seriously. Her mental health problems, you know, being misdiagnosed. So I think it was, you know, it was a kind of a catalogue of things that contributed to maybe, you know, the message not really being taken as seriously as it should have been.
I mean, I would add that in terms of where we are today, you know, you could say, especially when we're looking at female performers in the public eye and the treatment of these women by the media, things really haven't improved very much at all. And women are still, you know, female performers are still dismissed, underestimated, objectified, all of the things that my mother was sort of railing against and she experienced herself. We still see it today. And in terms of mental health, you know, there are too many victims of the machine. And, you know, my mother was she was experiencing this in the 70s, but, you know, we have many examples later on, you know, people like Amy Winehouse, Britney Spears, of course, women that are just kind of chewed up and spat out. So there's a long way to go, I think, until we really see solid improvement.
You can also see what you gain from making a movie from that intimate lens, because I think, you know, there's a lot about her sort of legacy as an artist and sort of the undercurrent of politics of what she's talking about, but she's also just really funny. Like there was loads of moments where I was just really laughing because she's so sharp and so funny and so clever, but also she's allowed to age. You know, we see this sort of development. She's not suspended in a time and a moment. So tell me a little bit about that, because I think you're really struck by how rare that can be in documentary form, where we often find women sort of in their 20s forever.
I mean, it was very important for us to, you know, in terms of the story, to really explore, you know, my mum's life in its entirety, and not to have, you know, all the focus being on the X-ray specs years, which was a very short time in her life. You know, she was in the band for 2-3 years, really. And by the age of 21, she had already embarked on a solo career. And she used to joke that, you know, she retired at 21. And then she had this whole life, you know, that was, much of it had nothing to do with music. It was her life as a mother. It was her life, her spiritual life. And it was a life, you know, where she faced many, many challenges with her mental health. And so it was really important that that part of her life, which is also where I come into the story as well, of course, because I was born after the X-ray specs period. It was really important for us to really give that, you know, post X-ray specs period the attention that it deserved. And seeing my mother as, you know, growing up, essentially, maturing, and then, you know, finding some kind of resolution and peace in her later life, that was very, very important for us.
Tell me a little bit about, I guess, those details, because, I mean, this is obviously a really good excuse to revisit the work, and I definitely have been like revisiting sort of old YouTube clips, and you're just so struck still about how extraordinary her voice is and how extraordinary the music is, and sort of how much you can hear in it and where that influences come from various different places. So from a sort of musical perspective, how has it felt revisiting it for all three of you, and sort of what are the feelings it elicits now that you have a more intimate understanding of the woman who was making and writing this?
I think one thing I noticed was that although, you know, X-ray specs were lumped in with the punk bands, you know, they were so much more, you know, in terms of it's pop music at the end of the day. And in terms of Poly's ability to write a 3-minute pop song in the way that, you know, the people that were writing for the, you know, 60s girl groups like the Ronettes and the Crystals and all those sort of bands, you know, Poly could do that. You know, you listen to something like Highly Inflammable and it's just a perfect bubblegum pop record. And then, you know, she could write Oh Bondage Up Yours, she could write a feminist anthem. And I think, I mean, if Poly had chosen to, because, you know, Poly didn't sell out, she could have done any number of things. But I mean, if she'd chosen to, and if, you know, if a route had been opened up, I could have imagined her being in somewhere like the Brill Building and just writing hits for people, you know, like say someone like Kathy Dennis has done for people like Kylie Minogue. I think if there's one shame about the story from a music perspective is that she didn't write more songs, but the ones that she, you know, left behind, and it's really been good to, you know, hear more from like Translucence, a solo album in the film, because that's an undiscovered classic for a lot of people. You know, that's a beautiful, beautiful record. I wouldn't have known that record if it wasn't for working on this film and Celeste saying, well, you know, she did this one as well, and actually like listening to it and thinking, wow, because that's again completely different to the X-ray spec stuff.
You know, often you'll see, anytime you see an article or anything written about my mum, it will always be, you know, punk will always be there in the title, you know. And she never really saw herself as a punk. And so when she made Translucent, that was her rebellion. That was the real, you know, it was the most punk thing she could do, was go and make a sort of jazz folk kind of, you know, singer-songwriter album with a session band. And you know, so it was really important for us to bring that music in, because you really see you know, X-ray Specs was fantastic. Joan for Adolescence is an amazing album, you know, just it's up there, you know, the greatest albums. But her later music is where I think you just saw a lot of her personal kind of struggles, and, you know, she's contemplating different things with Translucence and with some of the later music. She's also, you know, trying to express her spirituality. And the later music is, I think, more reflective of her own personal inner journey. And that's also where our film kind of goes as well, looking more at the relationship between my mum and myself.
I thought from the perspective of someone who's done music journalism, it was really interesting because it felt like it also reflected the lifespan of some music scenes, you know, how music scenes become birthed out of an exciting authentic DIY moment, and then suddenly when everybody catches up, people don't know what to do with somebody who doesn't look a certain way. So if you are, you know, a Black woman or a mixed race woman heading up a band, suddenly it really felt like, okay, this, you know, how do we describe you? And, you know, and then that's why we had these really shocking moments. Actually, I didn't realize that story about her being slimmed down on the album cover.
Yeah, this is something I discovered after interviewing Rena Vergano. So Rena Vergano is one of the contributors, and she was working with my mum as a kind of like a bit of PR, but also as she described herself as my mum's sort of caretaker for a while, or nanny, she even said. And yeah, she told me that, you know, my mum was really distressed that the record label had slimmed her image down. And there were lots of incidences like that. You know, she was also pressured to get the braces on her teeth by the label, because, you know, they thought that her teeth weren't straight enough, you know, to be heading a band like X-Ray Specs, because ultimately, you know, X-Ray Specs had come from that punk scene and did start out, you know, quite underground and DIY, but they actually had a great commercial appeal. And so they were picked up by a major label very early on. And that's when it kind of, you know, the process of glamorizing or just touching up and refining, that sort of process started to happen. And that's inevitable, you know, when you reach that, whenever you reach that level of sort of commercial success in the music industry, it's inevitable that there's going to be a lot more pressure, especially if you're a woman, mainly if you're a woman, to become more, you know, visually appealing, whatever that means. And that was a struggle, definitely. That aspect of it was hugely challenging for my mum.
One of the things that I found really funny and surprising was Jonathan Ross's contribution.
Yeah.
He talks about Poly Styrene gig being one of the first gigs that he ever went to. How did that come about? Did you know that? I mean, did you know that before you approached him, or was he just on a list for some reason? What happened?
I mean, I knew that he was a fan. My mum had, you know, she spoke about him actually sometimes. I think they'd met each other a few times. So he was definitely someone to put on the list, because my mum always spoke really highly of him, actually. And he's a lovely person, and he's just such, I mean, that interview was, you know, we interviewed so many people, and there were a few people that really stood out for me. One was Jonathan Ross, and the other one was Don Letts, just because they are such professionals. You know, it's kind of awe-inspiring to see them just, you know, you don't really need to ask them any questions, you know, just can let them speak, and you're like, wow, this is amazing, this is amazing, this is amazing. Because yeah, the delivery and the flow, I just really I really respect that, because I struggle, you know, to articulate in those kinds of situations. But yeah, they were both really just, you know, absolute professionals.
Jonathan Ross, in a way, is an editor's dream, because he can speak so eloquently and so fast that you can get so much in a small amount of time.
I mean, obviously we could talk about Poly all day, but to wrap up, I guess for me, the sort of most satisfying thing about this existing in the world is that it really opens up a conversation, either for people who were there and already part of it, or people who are new to the conversation of the contributions of Black women in this scene, and also in sort of British music history. And I think that that's, you know, sort of increasingly exciting, isn't it, for people to discover.
You know, what I hope people will get from watching the film, especially young people, is that my mother was someone that refused to be put into any kind of box, and she refused to accept limitations that society put on her, external limitations, and people say, no, you know, you can't do this, you have to be like this. She always forged her own path, and obviously there are consequences to being an individual. You know, my mother was truly an individual, and it won't always make for a happy life. And I think you see that in the film. You know, my mother didn't necessarily always have the happiest of lives, but what she achieved by being herself and staying true to herself was remarkable. And I hope that can be an inspiration to people when they're, especially young people, when they're watching the film.
Guys, thank you so much for joining me. That's great, and thank you for making the work. It's like very, very beautiful, and I'm sure lots of people will be watching it. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Rebecca, Paul and Celeste for joining me. And Poly Styrene, I Am a Cliché is on the BFI player now. And if you'd like to see more Q&As like this, you can subscribe to the BFI YouTube channel. Thank you.